Welcome to Road to Recovery.
Hello and welcome to Road to Recovery, Advocacy and Insights for Trucking Accidents with Sagi Shaked. Sagi is founder of Shaked Law Personal Injury Lawyers and is ranked as one of the top 100 trial lawyers in the United States by the American Trial Lawyers Association. With a wealth of experience in personal injury, wrongful death, and complex litigation cases, he passionately advocates for victims and has recovered multi-million-dollar settlements and damages for his clients. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today we're going to talk about wrongful death cases in trucking accidents, what every client and lawyer needs to know. Sagi, so good to see you again.
Likewise, good to see you, Kevin.
All right, so wrongful death cases resulting from trucking accidents in Florida are complex. We know this. What are some of the most important things that every client and really every attorney needs to know about these cases?
So, depending on what state you're in, but we'll assume for the purposes of today's podcast that we're in Florida. But this kind of applies to every state. So the most important thing that you want to do in a trucking case is preserve the evidence, because what happens is evidence gets destroyed. So it's so important to get out there right away. And I'll give you an example of a case that recently happened where the truck collision occurred. It looks like a car went underneath the trailer portion of the truck, right? And you would think, how did that happen? And the truck driver is going to say they had the green light versus the driver who can't say anything because they died when they made, impact underneath the trailer portion. Mm-hmm. So we were able to get to the scene on that one immediately, get to the buildings that were at that intersection and pull a video which completely contradicts what the truck driver said. So number one is preserving that evidence. Number two is knowing who the survivors are. So Florida law is a little different than some of the other states. So in Florida, in a trucking case, when you have a wrongful death case, who can recover is important, because sometimes family members don't understand who has the right to recover and who doesn't have a right. So let's go through that in a bit. Number one, who has a right to recover? If the person's married, then their spouse and children have a right to recover. Children under the age of 25, that's the way the law is defined in Florida. Now, if the person wasn't married, so let's say the person's 80 years old, then their children, even though they're adults, would be able to recover. So you have, if an 80-year-old passed away, you would have the children of that 80-year-old who could be 60s, 50s, 40s, and so on, they would be able to recover. So if a person doesn't have children and is not married, then their parents would be able to recover. So that's kind of understanding who are the beneficiaries under the law. That was Florida law. Every law is different in every state. So we said preservation letters and preservation of evidence, and then also know who the survivors are. So you know who you're representing and can tell the family up front. So you're not faced with a dilemma when one family member doesn't understand, how come I can't recover? How come they can recover? So those are the two basic premises that you want to get across when you're dealing with a wrongful death trucking accident.
Are there any special legal protections for truck drivers or trucking companies that families should be aware of?
Yeah, there are. So when you're dealing with a trucking collision case, whether it's a wrongful death case or an injury case, the attorney handling the case, and if you're trying to do it by yourself without an attorney, which I don't suggest, should be well versed in what's called the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulations. So those are regulations that were meant to protect the motoring public. And so that means that they have those regulations out there. The regulations are meant to protect, like I said, the motoring public. And so how do they do that? They ensure that drivers are not fatigued on the road. They ensure that trucking companies don't put on the road drivers that are not qualified. So for example, there's a key regulation under the Code of Federal Regulations, which is the statute, the federal statute, that requires motor carriers to do their investigation of the drivers. You can't just hire someone. You have to do your investigation of that driver. So you can't just say, hey, I like your driver's license is fine. You need to find out every place they've ever worked. You need to speak with those other employers. You need to find out if they've had prior accidents. Otherwise, you're putting this person on the road, and it's a danger to society. That's why we have those laws in place. So one of the key federal regulations that we always look at is the driver qualification file, not just from the company that they were in at the time of the crash, but the companies that hired them in the past. Why did they get fired in the past, or why did they leave those jobs? There's gems in those qualification files that we need to get. Now, a company, this is important, one of these motor companies or trucking motor carrier companies, they only have to retain that file for 3 years. So that's why preservation of evidence, as soon as you get that truck accident case, immediately send out those preservation letters and make sure the trucking company knows to preserve that driver qualification file. And I would say, take it even a step further, you want to get into litigation soon, because once those files disappear, it's going to be hard to get them. So let's say you got the driver qualification file, you find out where that person worked before, now you're subpoenaing all those prior employers to get their driver qualification files. And did the current employer that they were involved with the crash, did they know about this information? And if they didn't, why didn't they know? Why didn't they do their due diligence? Why didn't they comply with the law? So that's a key regulation that's important in all trucking cases.
I led with the fact that trucking accidents are complex, and you're proving that early in the conversation. They are definitely very complex and different than other things we've talked about on this podcast. What other ways are they more complex than a typical accident?
A truck driver is a professional driver, which means, again, going back to those federal motor carrier safety rules, safety regulations, which again were meant to protect the public, they have rules on how many hours a truck driver can be on the road. They have rules on what happens after a crash. So a lot of times you see after a crash, if there's injuries, of course, the trucking companies have to, this is a regulation, they have to do the alcohol and drug testing immediately after the crash, as soon as practical. And so what does that mean? If the driver of the truck was sent to the hospital, they should be requesting that they draw blood from that person. If not, let's say the truck driver wasn't hurt, because a lot of times the truck drivers are not hurt. They're in this big monstrosity of a vehicle, whereas most of our clients are in cars or motorcycles or pedestrians. They don't have the protection of the big truck. So the trucking company has to send that driver immediately to a facility to get tested for drugs and alcohol. Meaning if they've had any type, obviously they shouldn't be driving when they're doing drugs, or they shouldn't be doing drugs, period. But if they had alcohol, they have to at least be sober for 4 hours prior to getting on the road. So, but a lot of times you see this where drivers are drunk and they're endangering everybody on the road, including you, me, and everyone else on the road. And if they're doing drugs like, smoking, we had one that was smoking crack while he was driving, and you look at me with a face of shock, but it's true.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah, there are dangerous truck drivers on the road. Again, not all of them, but there are bad ones. And this is where we come in. We're kind of the equalizer, making sure that trucking companies actually follow the law and adhere to everything that it was meant to be. The purpose of it is to keep our roads safe. We want people getting their goods from one place to another, but don't put everybody at risk.
Right.
So that's another, little complex nuance that if it's not done, for example, let's say the trucking company didn't go about and get that blood test or that drug test or the alcohol test as soon as practical. And as soon as practical means pretty much fast. It doesn't mean wait days on end, because of course stuff disappears from the blood and the test. So as soon as practical, if they don't do that, then we can use what's called a presumption against the trucking company. Meaning they're presumed that their driver was drunk or intoxicated or under the influence of a narcotic that affected their ability to understand what was going on. So that's a super important little nuance in the law. That's different than when you have a car on car. Car on car, most people that just drive their car for pleasure, or they drive it for work, but they're not driving the long distances that a trucker is driving. So they're not subject to those vigorous tests, driver qualification files, and everything else, hours of service that a truck driver would. You can just get your driver's license and voila, you're back on the road and drive away. So that's a little different, a little nuance that makes trucking cases more complex. And you really need to have someone that knows what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. So how are damages for emotional pain and suffering assessed in the wrongful death cases?
When you have a wrongful death case, they're looking at the different types of damages. And so most states' damages are almost the same. They just label them differently. Mm-hmm. In Florida, if a person loses a loved one, let's say it's the spouse that survives is entitled to the love, the companionship, the guidance, the support that they would get from their spouse. Children, on the other hand, would be entitled to guidance and support and love. Obviously, there's not companionship, but they would be entitled to that from the wrongful death statute, from the settlement. So it really depends who the survivor is and what they're entitled to. But in essence, like I'll give you an example. Let's compare and contrast to New York. Florida allows for the survivor's pain and suffering. So if the wife lost her husband, she would be entitled to her pain and suffering for the rest of her life for what happened to her husband. In New York, a wrongful death case, the valuations are not the same as other states because, again, we're comparing to Florida, and I'm licensed in both. So in New York, you would only get the decedent, meaning the person who's died, their pain and suffering. So if, for example, the person that died survived for 30 seconds, then that's what you would be entitled to, the 30 seconds of pain and suffering that person went through before they died. The survivor's family in New York are not entitled to their own pain and suffering. Now compare that to Florida. Florida, the survivors would be entitled to the survivor's pain and suffering for the loss of their loved one. So it's a little different, and every state has their own little nuances. So the value of a wrongful death case in Florida is going to be a lot higher than the value of a wrongful death case in New York. And some people ask, it's not fair. And you're right, it's not fair. It's the way the legislature makes these statutes, and we have to comply with them. You really can't put a value on someone's life. So we're looking at the case as a whole and what is the value of a case? And then where do you try the case? That makes a difference as well. Is it in a smaller county or a bigger county? And for some reason, some bigger counties give more money. It just depends. The value of a loved one to me is in the billions, trillions. Some people on a jury only give millions. So it really depends on what jurisdiction you're in.
How does the presence of commercial insurance policies impact the wrongful death trucking accident cases?
Yeah, you got a lot of good questions, Kevin.
Thank you.
So in commercial trucking cases, most of the time you're going to see, if we're talking about interstate, that there's going to be a minimum of $750,000 in insurance. Now, that's obviously not enough for a wrongful death case, and it's usually not enough for any type of real serious injury case, but that'll be kind of the minimum you'll see in interstate travel. So let's go back. Interstate travel is between different states. Intra, INTRA, is within a state. The amount of insurance coverage is different when you're traveling within the state. It doesn't have to be as high as $750,000. So the trucking companies that do intrastate, lower insurance. The trucking companies that do interstate travel between the different states, that's going to be higher coverage with a minimum of $750,000. Now, if it's a trucking company that's hauling something hazardous, for example, gas, you're going to see coverage high as $5 million. So, because usually the injuries are a lot worse, and it's, someone could get burned. Hopefully not. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but it's happened. And we have a current case going on right now where an individual was involved with a collision with a tanker, a gas tanker, and got burned really, really bad and didn't survive. So they have more coverage, even though in that case, the tanker is not at fault. It's another vehicle that's at fault. But that's coming up for trial. So we'll see what happens in that case.
Oh, that sounds awful.
Yeah.
It's a tough way to go for sure. We touched on expert testimony before. How does that play into the wrongful death accident cases with trucking in the trucking industry? And how do you go about selecting the right experts?
When we talk about experts in dealing with trucking accidents, we're looking at experts for liability, which is how the crash occurred, experts for trucking regulations, which also deals with how the truck occurred, experts dealing with the regulations, which also deal with how truck accidents occur. And then we have experts that deal with the injuries and the damages. And in a wrongful death case, you'll have a grief expert, because not everybody understands grief. Hopefully, most people have not had to deal with someone tragically passing from a collision or a horrific act. And that type of grief is different than someone who's in their, let's say, late 80s or 90s, and has lived a long life and their family by their bedside, and they're expecting that person to pass. So a grief expert will explain the different stages of grief. Now, as far as liability, how the truck collision occurred, we're going to get an accident reconstructionist involved, a human factors expert involved. Potentially, we'll get a professional photographer, not as an expert, but to document the scene in terms of trucking regulations. We have a couple of former truck drivers who are experts in the field in knowing what you're supposed to do from a trucking company standpoint and how they're supposed to handle their own cases and how they're supposed to handle their drivers. So we bring them on to talk about the hours of service, where they were violated or not, what other regulations were violated. And so that combination of those experts together with the grief expert is kind of how we put these cases together. So usually you'll see anywhere from 4 to 5 different experts in different fields.
Okay. And what can families expect in terms of the settlement process for wrongful death cases, specifically involving truck accidents?
So when we're trying to settle a case, it'll really depend on, is there enough insurance out there? And usually there never is. I mean, you'd have to have billions of dollars, and then they'd have to willing to pay. So otherwise, if they don't pay, you go to trial. So in terms of understanding the settlement process, what I would tell every family is expect a long process. Why do I say that? Insurance companies don't want these cases to settle right away. If your lawyer is settling them right away, it's either one of two things. One, there's not enough insurance out there. Or two, they're just looking for the quick money. And sometimes an insurance company will throw $1 million on a case when in reality the case is worth $10 million and there's $10 million in insurance. So if they're leaving money on the table, that's a problem for the client. I'll give you an example. When you have someone who's self-insured, I know one of our podcasts is coming up on Publix, for example. Publix, if for those of you who are listening outside the state of Florida or Georgia or the East Coast, Publix is a major supermarket across the East Coast with over like 1,500 locations. And so they have their own trucks and they are what's called self-insured. Sort of, if you're big enough, you can insure yourself. And so they may say, hey, look, there's only $1 million worth of insurance. That's not true. Publix is worth billions and billions of dollars. So you don't have to be limited to that insurance amount. Now, let's say you're dealing with the mom and pop type of trucking company. That could be a little different. They may have one truck only. They're hauling for a different company. So you have to think outside the box. You can't just be limited to that one trucking company, the mom and pop. Usually if it's a mom and pop, meaning one trucking company, one truck trucking company, there may be a dispatcher involved. There may be a broker involved. There may be a shipper involved. So you have to look beyond that. That's why you need to go to someone who really deals with trucking, who's not just looking for the quick settlement to put it behind them and move on and, get their advertising budget, taken care of. You need someone who's willing to look beyond and go the long term, which means getting it close to trial or trying the case, because that's what's going to get you real justice.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to Road to Recovery, Advocacy and Insights for Trucking Accidents with Sagi Shaked. For more information or to connect with Sagi, visit shakedlaw.com. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review in the comments. Sagi, always great to talk to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.